On January 7, 1945, amidst the snow-covered Ardennes forest, a shocking event unfolded inside the British military press tent. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stepped before reporters with a triumphant air. Under the flashing bulbs, he showed no signs of exhaustion despite having just endured the life-and-death stakes of battle. Instead, he radiated the smugness of a man who believed he alone had saved the day. Montgomery declared that the Battle of the Bulge was one of the trickiest challenges he had ever commanded. However, the way he spoke of the American military left many stunned. He viewed them not as comrades in arms, but as children in need of his rescue. The word "I" was repeated incessantly. I employed the whole available power, I put it into the fight with a bang. In the eyes of the media at that moment, he was a hero. But just a few hundred meters away at the Allied Supreme Headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was seething with rage as he read the transcript of the speech. For 3 years, Eisenhower had played the peacemaker, enduring every mockery to keep the alliance intact. But this time, the glass had overflowed. Montgomery believed his position was untouchable, unaware that he was personally ending his own career. To understand why that press conference became a suicide note, we must look back at the turbulent relationship between the British and American commands. This was an alliance born of necessity rather than friendship. On one side was Eisenhower, Ike, a politician in uniform who viewed war as a collective effort. On the other was Montgomery, Monty, the hero of El Alamein, a tactical genius but profoundly narcissistic. To Monty, war was a solo stage where he was the brightest star and the Americans were merely the supporting cast. He made no secret of his disdain for Eisenhower, considering Ike a mere logistics expert who didn't know how to lead a fight. Tensions reached a breaking point when Monty demanded absolute command of all ground forces, a request tantamount to asking Eisenhower to demote himself. Although Washington loathed this attitude, Eisenhower had always protected Monty because of his military talent. It was a trade-off. America provided the resources, and Britain provided the experience. However, by the end of 1944, the balance of power had shifted drastically in America's favor. But Monty remained stuck in the past. Inside his mobile command trailer, he constructed a private world where he was the sole savior of the Allies. Looking at the maps, Monty saw only incompetence in American generals like Bradley or Patton. He believed Eisenhower's broad front strategy was the cause of the chaos. Sitting with his cup of tea, Monty was convinced that destiny had chosen him to lead the war. He wrote letters to London disparaging the Americans as useless. Monty didn't do this out of malice, but out of a blind faith in his own superiority. He was certain the Americans needed him so much that they would accept any demand. He assumed Eisenhower was too weak to punish him. It was a fatal mistake. Monty forgot that no matter how talented he was still a subordinate soldier, and no one is irreplaceable. The fuse was truly lit on December 16, 1944, when Germany launched a surprise offensive in the Ardennes. This strike split General Omar Bradley's forces in two, causing total chaos within the American ranks. Faced with this situation, Eisenhower made a pragmatic decision. He temporarily transferred 200,000 American troops in the north to Montgomery's command to ensure unity of effort. This was a massive sacrifice of pride for American generals like Bradley and Patton. They accepted it for the greater good, but they expected from Monty a level of professionalism and a minimum of respect among peers. Instead, Monty did the opposite. He arrived at the American headquarters with the air of a feudal lord. He ignored the exhausted officers, rejected all their plans, and lectured seasoned generals like failing students. His reported comment, "I shall tidy up this mess," became an unforgettable humiliation for the American staff. He even forced Bradley to humble himself by traveling to meet Monty instead of coordinating proactively. Monty's arrogance turned the Allied interior toxic. However, because Monty had successfully stabilized the northern front, he mistook the Americans' disciplined silence for admiration. The January 7th press conference was the final straw. Monty distorted reality, turning a tragic battle where tens of thousands of Americans fell into a tactical exercise, where he was the sole hero. As the British press hailed Monty as the savior of the Yanks, General Bradley declared he would rather resign than serve under Monty again. The entire American command was in a state of revolt. Eisenhower realized he could no longer remain patient. In the silence of his office, Ike picked up his pen and drafted a cable to Washington with a firm resolve: either Montgomery must change, or Eisenhower himself would resign. Inside the quiet office at the Supreme Headquarters, the air was thick with tension. Eisenhower, a man famous for his jovial smile and extraordinary endurance, sat motionless at his desk. In his hand was the full transcript of Montgomery's press conference. Every line felt like a knife twisting into the efforts to mend the alliance that Ike had painstakingly built over years. He understood that this was not just a slip of the tongue. It was a betrayal of trust. While tens of thousands of American soldiers were dying in the freezing cold of Bastogne and St. Vith, Montgomery stood before the cameras to gloat about his genius. Eisenhower held his pen, his hands no longer shaking with anger but becoming terrifyingly cold. He began drafting the cable to General George Marshall in Washington. The content of the cable contained no insults, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. Eisenhower bluntly admitted that the current command structure was paralyzed by a lack of respect. He presented a grim choice to the leaders of the Allied powers: either Montgomery must change his attitude and accept control, or I cannot continue to carry this responsibility. This was an all-in gamble unprecedented in modern military history. Eisenhower was putting the seat of the Supreme Allied Commander on the line against the most famous Field Marshal of the British Empire. This was not just a personal conflict, but a collision of two ideologies: American collective teamwork versus the individualized militaristic tradition of the old British military aristocracy. Ike knew that if Washington chose him, Montgomery would have to go. Conversely, if London defended Montgomery to the end, the alliance would shatter on the doorstep of victory. He forced the highest levels, from President Roosevelt to Prime Minister Churchill, to face a reality: did they need a man who could coordinate a massive machine, or an exceptional individual who was uncontrollable? When Major General Freddie de Guingand, Montgomery's chief of staff and the vital bridge between the two sides, read the draft of the cable, he was stunned. The experienced general's face suddenly turned pale. De Guingand understood Eisenhower better than anyone in the British command. He knew that once Ike had put these words on paper, there was no turning back. He realized that his boss, Monty, had crossed the line. This time, arrogance had pushed Montgomery into total isolation. Even Winston Churchill, who had many times shielded the wayward son of the British Army, would not dare trade the relationship with the United States just to salvage the ego of a field marshal. De Guingand knew he had only a few hours to prevent a diplomatic catastrophe that could change the course of the war. Without waiting a single second, de Guingand rushed out of the office. He raced his car through the snowy trails of the Ardennes to reach Montgomery's base. Only one thought occupied his mind: he had to make Monty wake up before the cable was officially sent. The scene of de Guingand bursting into Montgomery's trailer was one of the most dramatic moments. Monty was still relaxed at the time, even somewhat pleased with the press attention. When de Guingand slammed the draft onto the table and shouted that Eisenhower was preparing to fire him, silence filled the cramped space. Initially, Montgomery remained skeptical, even a bit disdainful. Ike wouldn't do that, he needs me, Monty replied. But as de Gingan described in detail the fierce resolve in Eisenhower's eyes and the fact that Washington was ready to erase his name, Monty's wall of pride began to crack. For the first time, people saw Field Marshal Montgomery, the man who once defeated Rommel at El Alamein, show fear. He collapsed into his chair, his appearance suddenly becoming old and small. The naked truth was revealed: he was not irreplaceable. He realized he had completely miscalculated Eisenhower's patience. The student Ike, whom he had always looked down upon, was actually the man holding his destiny in his hands. Why did things become this severe? The answer lies in the shift of the global power balance. Montgomery was still living in the glory of 1942, when Britain was the main pillar of the Allies. But by 1945, reality was different. The United States had become the arsenal of democracy, providing 80% of the manpower and most of the equipment and financial resources. Monty had failed to realize that this was no longer the British Empire's war alone. The Americans were no longer in the apprentice role. Generals like Bradley or Patton had proven their command capabilities on the battlefield. Monty's condescension was not just a personal insult, but an affront to the blood and self-respect of an entire nation carrying the primary burden of the war. The greatest difference between the two men lay in their philosophy of war. For Montgomery, war was like a pure game of chess, where pieces were moved based on mathematical logic and he was the grandmaster. But for Eisenhower, war was a painful human endeavor. He understood that the most important ammunition was not gunpowder, but the team spirit and mutual trust among soldiers. Monty's actions directly threatened the political stability of the alliance. If American generals resigned en masse due to being humiliated, the front would collapse from within before the Germans could even act. Eisenhower chose to protect the soul of the army rather than indulge a brilliant but toxic tactical mind. The next morning, a hurriedly written letter appeared on Eisenhower's desk. It was not a dry military document, but a sincere plea that was shocking in its tone. Montgomery, a man who never admitted fault, wrote, "I am distressed that my note may have upset you. I am your very devoted subordinate." He accepted all conditions, promising to remain silent before the media and to obey absolutely. This was the most humiliating moment of Monty's career, but it was also the final act of salvation to keep him from being cast out of history in the worst possible way. Eisenhower read the letter and agreed to withdraw the firing order. However, his leniency did not mean forgiveness. Trust, once lost, can never be restored. From that moment on, the relationship between the two most powerful men on the Western Front became nothing more than cold, professional formalities. Ike no longer consulted Monty on major strategies. He began to isolate the British Field Marshal from the core circle of influence. The Supreme Commander's trust shifted entirely to blood brothers like Bradley, men who knew how to put collective interest above personal ego. In the final months of the war, as the Allies crossed the Rhine and surged into the heart of Germany, the marginalization became clear. Eisenhower prioritized all resources and glory for the American Corps. Montgomery was pushed toward a secondary axis of attack, where he organized an elaborate river crossing that, in reality, held less strategic significance than what American soldiers had achieved at Remagen. The alliance was saved from disintegration, but the price paid was a permanent fracture in the Anglo-American command relationship. The friendship between generals, which served as the glue binding nations, was incinerated in the flames of arrogance. Even Prime Minister Churchill had to bitterly admit that Montgomery had nearly ruined all his diplomatic efforts. After the war, although Monty was still worshipped as a god by the British public, among the leadership elite, he became a figure to be guarded against. He kept his rank and his medals, but he lost the actual power to shape the new world order. Eisenhower's victory over Montgomery in the Ardennes is historical proof that, in moments of life and death, human management skills and humility are worth many times more than innate talent. Talent can help you win a battle, but only character helps you win a war and keep the respect of your comrades. Montgomery may have been a military genius, but he forgot a fundamental thing: he was not fighting alone. The lack of respect for those bleeding beside him was the greatest barrier preventing him from becoming a truly great leader. The story of Eisenhower and Montgomery in the Ardennes is not just a military anecdote. It is an eternal lesson in management and leadership ethics. Montgomery thought he stood above the war, that the world revolved around his plans. But Eisenhower used an ultimatum to remind him, in a great mission, no individual is permitted to stand above the collective. The Allied alliance was not saved by cannon fire that day, but by the character of a man who dared to say no to arrogance, in order to protect the righteousness of the entire mission. The story between Eisenhower and Montgomery is not just a history of smoke and fire, it is a precious lesson in the art of living and leading. It reminds us that, in any collective, talent can take you to the top, but only character can keep you there. Montgomery possessed the brilliance of a genius but lacked the humility to empathize with his comrades. He forgot that, no matter how talented you are, if you do not respect those going through fire with you, you will soon become lonely on your own throne. Conversely, Eisenhower proved that, true power does not lie in imposing one's ego, but in the ability to connect and protect shared values. Sometimes, the greatest victory is not defeating the enemy, but conquering one's own pride. If you find this story of the war in the office interesting and it brings you new perspectives on leadership thinking, please support the channel by hitting like to give us more motivation to release more high-quality content. Subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss our dramatic historical journeys every week. Sharing this video with friends who also love history and valuable life lessons. Commenting below to let us know your thoughts. If you were Eisenhower in that situation, would you have made such a tough decision? Or do you think Montgomery was treated too harshly? Each of your interactions is a brick building our history-loving community. Thank you for watching, goodbye, and see you in the next stories.